Hi, everyone. My name's Alex A. Teague. I am BARDA Program Manager here at UMass M2D2. And today we're going to be hearing from Abbas Dhilawala, CTO of Galen Data, on medical device connectivity, regulations, privacy, and cybersecurity. Abbas, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Alexi. So my name is Abbas, and thanks for joining this webinar. Just a quick background on me. I have about 18 years of software development experience, 16 of those in healthcare. I've been involved in software development efforts from small startups to large medical device companies across kind of different modalities and embedded, mobile, cloud, and other development. And today, I want to talk about some important aspects to think through when we are pursuing medical device connectivity. So I want to start first by kind of figuring out some of the, why do device connectivity, why connect the device? Some of the benefits are obvious, but I want to go through some of the important ones just as a general background. So think of some of the use cases such as remote monitoring, right? So remote monitoring has become essential in many kind of settings. Think of telehealth. Right now, as of last year, roughly 10% of the visits were done through telehealth. In the heart of the pandemic, in early 2020, it was as high as 20%. So telehealth is slowly increasing. It did get a spike, has come down back to kind of where it's still an upward trajectory. And so telehealth requires devices to be connected so they remotely can be accessed via the providers and other stakeholders that need that access to that data. And then patient compliance. There have been some industries where patient compliance is required as part of reimbursement. For example, the sleep. If you want to get your kind of back from insurance companies or something reimbursed, you have to prove that the patient is compliant, patient is doing the therapy, and patient compliance is required, is becoming more and more required in other industries and other sectors of healthcare as well. I think value-based care is one of the places where effectiveness of a device or a therapy is important, and one way to do that is ensuring patient compliance. Other aspects is, coming up with new business models that connectivity can unleash. Think of things like diagnosis as a service, so test kits that do diagnosis. Most recent example being the COVID at-home test, but there's other tests that can do, tests starting with imaging, tests through your smartphones, simple tests that deal with urine or stool, things like that, that are making more and more into kind of the at-home, and the ability to, instead of having to send samples back, a lot of these are collecting data on situ and as the test is done, and then providing a faster and more seamless experience. And then device as a service, a lot of devices are still sold, but there's a movement towards going into subscription. Everything in the world is going to subscription, including your seats and in your cars, the heat function in the car. Devices are no different. So there's a lot of medical device players now looking at device as a service. For that, though, you do need connectivity. You need to know when the device is used, when the therapy is used, when the function was used, and then you can charge accordingly. That helps also a lot of the providers, like especially big healthcare organizations in kind of budgeting. So it's kind of catching on as well. Another thing is just your pure device surveillance and R&D functions. So when you deploy devices in the field, you have issues. You need to understand your device health. Having connected devices allows you to kind of do monitoring essentially nonstop and making sure you can catch things before it becomes an issue. Diagnosis. So if you do find something, instead of having to ship that device back and read its logs and then figure it out, or worse for some large equipment, having sent people down to certain places to kind of do the diagnosis. If you have connectivity, the remote device diagnosis becomes an option. And then the general R&D, so getting data for the future, right? So you may not need data right now, but you may imagine what other options that data can unleash, right? So new modalities that you can target, new functions you can do, new things you can improve depending on kind of how the device is being used or not used. And all that stuff, data can provide an avenue for that. And then just in general, from a healthcare efficiency perspective, having connected devices reduces error. So I don't have to, translate or transcribe information from one place to another. So that helps reduction in error, and then ultimately provides time saving. So if you have devices that can connect to the cloud, eventually connect to the EHRs, that's very attractive to healthcare delivery organizations and the large hospital and stuff. So it becomes a part of your sales efficiency as well. But when you do connectivity, not everything is peachy, right? So there's speed bumps in the path to that cloud connectivity. We're going to talk about three of those today: security and privacy, the most obvious one. The regulatory landscape is changing for connectivity, and what are the effects of that? And then general cost and effort. This is not free, right? So there's an ROI to that. So what are the costs and effort, and then how can we reduce that? So let's talk about these three things one by one. So from a security and privacy, before we go into specifics, let's look at some of the compromise trends and the security compromises over the last 6-7 years. So this is a chart that talks about, this is industry-wide, so it's not healthcare. This is US only though. So in the United States, in the last 7 years, 7 years, from 2015 to 2021, the number of compromises, the number of attacks, and the number of victims, the number of people that get affected, right? So if you see from 2015, it's steadily increasing the number of compromises. So there's more and more people trying to get into systems. Again, this is industry-wide, so not healthcare, but the general trend. But if you look at the number of victims, there's a steady drop. There was a spike early in 2016, but then from that point on, it's steadily going down. Once you start looking into sector-wise, so like if you look industry-specific sector trends, if you look at healthcare, you see that there's a reverse trend here in healthcare. While the number of attacks or compromises are relatively stable, the number of victims has gone up, which means that the attacks are becoming more efficient in finding and getting access to data or compromising devices or systems. So that's a worrying trend. Cybersecurity and privacy. Also, the problem we see right now is just a myriad amount of security and privacy laws, regulations, standards. Each country, city, state, each municipality, it seems like has its own thing that needs to be done. Here's just a list of some very major laws, regulation, and guidance. And these are not worldwide. This is just US, Canada, and Europe. And there's not a comprehensive list either. And then there is a myriad amount of industry standards. So all these have different requirements, different things you have to do as a part of your design, different things you have to do as part of your kind of production and operation support. When compromises happen, who to notify, how quickly to notify, and all that stuff. It just gets very complicated very soon. So what do we do? Well, there are a few steps we can take to manage privacy and security that works across all these standards and regulatory requirements. These are not comprehensive, but these are the main three things I want to talk about. That gives you a very good framework on which to build your cybersecurity and your privacy aspects of your connected devices. So first thing I want to talk about is culture. Why is culture important, and what does it do in terms of cybersecurity? Also talk about integrating cybersecurity as part of your design lifecycle, not something you just bolt at the end to kind of comply, but how do you integrate it just like you would do with quality, hopefully. You're integrating that in your design lifecycle as well. And then just from a business perspective, how do you set up protections that helps your business in general? So we'll talk about these three in details. So from a culture of cybersecurity, what does culture mean, right? So culture means that it's very important aspect, in my opinion, of cybersecurity, and it's very underappreciated aspect of security protection. What culture means is essentially that everybody understands what their role is within cybersecurity. It's not something that only the IT people or your cybersecurity operators are worried about. It's something that everyone, from your designers to your engineers to management to sales to marketing, everybody understands what cybersecurity is, because it only takes, it takes very little to get access, right? So one compromise or one person doing the wrong thing, clicking on the wrong link, downloading the wrong thing can affect your cybersecurity aspect of it. So a culture which appreciates cybersecurity, which understands the risk associated with these things, works with your processes, works with your procedure is important. I compare cybersecurity with quality a lot because the same things apply. Quality as a culture is important in medical device or in any organization for that matter. If you want to build quality products, again, not something you do at the end or just as you hire one person and says your job is quality. You may have quality people, but quality throughout and has to be ingrained in your company. Cybersecurity is very simple things. If it's not, it's not going to really work in the long term. Training is important, that you want to regularly train your employees because these things change, and also because it becomes even if things, if it hasn't changed, just having that feedback loop constantly going help people remember and be on their toes when things come like that, and find and define your access control. Define within the company itself, how would you provide access to different people with different data that they can do their job, but they can do his job in a way that is secure. So if you are doing, for example, if you have customer support that needs access to patient data, that that to help the device, obviously they need that access for their job, but how do you limit that to only those people, or how do you train them in maybe a different way? How do you control access that they only can access from certain points within your organization, or certain with certain extra access or stuff like that? So set up a proper access control and review those proper access controls regularly is very important. But training people and making sure that everybody understands the importance of cybersecurity is it's a hard thing to do, and generally starts from top to bottom. But it's something that is very essential if you do care about cybersecurity in general. And then this extends, from an education perspective, extends, to your users of the devices, right? So providers, patients maybe, and how do you enable that? A lot of cybersecurity there's a question about, from a usability perspective, how is usability and cybersecurity go together? A lot of that is framing. Right. So as part of your framing or education or marketing to your patients or to your customers, you can ingrain that cybersecurity is needed. For example, if I go to a bank, let's say a bank website, and I log in and it doesn't ask me for my, let's say, my two-factor authentication, I may feel that's weird because it's an important function of my life. It keeps all my finances. It's very important to my personal life. And if it's not secure, I feel that problem, and I will do that. I will do that two-factor authentication because it's the framework. The problem here is set up in a way that it's important to me. If I go to, let's say, a news site and I log in and they ask for two-factor authentication, it sounds ridiculous. Same function, but very different context. And so if you frame it differently, it's important that people appreciate the importance of healthcare records, healthcare data, access to the devices, device access to data from the devices and the functions on those devices, that there need to be security in there. So it's a lot of that cybersecurity culture also should permeate into your user guides, into your marketing materials, into your just a general education. Let's talk about a second aspect here, which is making cybersecurity part of your product lifecycle. Right. So there is a new guideline from the FDA that came out in April of this year around cybersecurity and pre-market submissions, and the FDA has worked through many years. They've had they had a guidance in 2014. They came up with a draft guidance in 2018. Got a lot of feedback. The draft remained draft, and they came back with a new draft in 2022. It's much bigger, much complex, but the most important thing in there that they talk about is the idea of secure product development framework. So what does that mean? Essentially, that you integrate your cybersecurity part of the entire lifecycle, not just at the end or the start, but through design. So which means you start risk planning and assessment. That you do a design with security in mind to begin with, and then as you move into operation, as you move in production and then commercialization, that you develop procedures and functions around managing cybersecurity, like surveillance program. Like we do surveillance for safety risks, similarly surveillance for cybersecurity risks. and much different. So what does that mean? So starts again with risk planning assessment. Like anything in healthcare, everything is risk-based. So first thing you want to do in risk planning assessment is you start over and say, you do this early in the design lifecycle as you are doing risk assessment for safety, risk assessment for your design problems. You do risk assessment of your cybersecurity, and you just like any other risk, it has to be in the entire lifecycle. So as you update functions, as new information comes through, you go and replan and reassess those risks. Part of the risk assessment is to identify all the data you're going to cover and what of those data are protected. Not all data is protected, but a lot of the data is protected. And sometimes you have data that may on its own may not be very protected. For example, if I'm only collecting, let's say, zip code, if it's a reasonably big zip code, it's not considered protected because there's just no way to, identify that information with a reasonably identify with a person or a small group of people, but to start adding to that data. So originally I'm collecting health data, but then I'm collecting zip code as a demographic. But then if I start adding to it, let's say age, I'm starting adding to maybe the clinics they visit. Now I'm getting a slightly more narrower group, and which is why it kind of goes into that gray area of is this information now protected or not. So identify both current protected data and maybe potential protected data. Do threat modeling. So what threat modeling does is essentially identifies risk not only from a device perspective, but the environment itself. So it's not what can go bad in the device, but what can go bad in the device if a device is connected to, let's say, a user's at home Wi-Fi, which probably may not be very secure, or if it's connected to a hospital network that has 20 other devices, which their security may be questionable as best. So you have to kind of consider kind of the environment aspect of where it's deployed, how it's operated, who the users are, how sophisticated they are, all that stuff within a comprehensive risk assessment, and essentially called threat model. This is something the FDA, if the draft guidance of 2022 becomes required, and it's going to be essential. And it's the draft guidance is draft, but don't get fooled by the name draft. It's essentially the current thinking of the FDA. So they're already kind of requiring some higher risk devices to provide a threat modeling. So this is something that will become more and more required as we go through for other categories of the devices as well. And there's a lot of resources. The best ones I've seen is around the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, on their webpage. You can find some really good threat modeling tools. Microsoft has a threat modeling. It's a free tool that you can download that has built-in, once you design your architecture, you put in how your device is deployed. We'll start with a very well-known risks, so it gives you a framework to build upon. So very important to do threat modeling. And again, this is something that has to change over time as your environment changes, as more information comes, as the device characteristics changes. Assessing vulnerabilities, so identifying vulnerabilities that could lead to harm. So these vulnerabilities are essentially, if you're familiar with standard safety risk, think of these as, if you're doing like a FMEA kind of stuff, these are like your faults. So what can go wrong, and what are the problems within your devices? Is your authentication weak? Is it how are you sending data? Is it is it encrypted? Is it not encrypted? Those kind of things. You assess all the different vulnerabilities. Can somebody just get the data transmission and stuff like that? And then you assess harm, right? So what happens to the if those vulnerabilities are exploited? What's the harm to the patient? So again, very similar to safety risk, same process, same general risk assessment, and then assign a probability of such event happening. Now the probability is only for priority, right? Probability shouldn't be used to completely discard those risks. It's just to identify what should I address first. Obviously, there is limited resources. Nobody has unlimited resource time and money. So there's always going to be certain risks that you accept, and you have to do your risk-benefit analysis at the end, just like you do with your safety risk. You do that with a cybersecurity risk. But you want to assess probability. You can use probability matrix or data for probability assessment from kind of well-known industry data points available in terms of, for example, if you have a vulnerability that allows somebody to send data without the authentication authenticated. There's enough data available out there to kind of see how probable that event is, right? And then obviously there's a probability of success and a probability of event happening, and you kind of assume that success is, for cybersecurity, success is almost always 100% because you don't have a really good way to know what failures happen. You only have data about successful events. You don't have data generally about unsuccessful events. So the probability of success is kind of given to be 100% if it happens. And then once you have assessed the risk assessment and as you move towards design of your device, again, keep security in mind. You want to understand security from the get-go, how everything is going to be accessed and operated. So identity and access management are very important. Specifically, if your device is going to not just send data but also retrieve data or store data and have functions that can be accessed remotely, you want to understand all that. Who can do things and what are the access rules and how do you change them over time. And so part of that is authentication. So how you go authenticate devices, how you're authenticating a user. Is it requiring user to put in a PIN, a username, password, biometrics? What are those different mechanisms you have? And then if some of these functions are critical, then you also want to understand what's the backup, or do you allow certain things to happen on the device itself? There's buttons that do the things on the device that can be done at any time, but if you're doing it remotely, you need authentication. So tough things like that. You always want to make sure that cybersecurity prevention isn't affecting your risk profile, and you're not putting in a patient or a provider in any kind of harm because you're expecting them to type in a long password in emergency. Right? It's not going to happen. So things like that, you have to always keep that balance in the risk processes, and the safety and cybersecurity have a lot of intersection. So you want to keep that in mind. But some sort of remote function, if there is, you want authentication. If a device is going to send data, you want to authenticate that it's both ways, that the device is sending to the right thing, but also the right thing is sending data to your backend or your cloud. So that you're not getting fake data or wrong data. And then encryption has become so accessible and so easy now, with a lot of software libraries and a lot of hardware accelerated modules, that it's almost a given that you want to encrypt anything you transmit over any sort of network, whether it be Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or cellular or whatever other mechanism, any kind of network, and you want to store. If you're going to store it in device or you store it in the cloud, store it encrypted. It's very easy to do these days, and unless you have a very, very constrained system that just cannot, for whatever reason, support. So in very small cases, most other than that, you should have encryption by default. And then audit trail, very important. This is useful if something happens and have to go back. So think about that. How would you keep an audit trail of all the things that happened, so you can go back and figure out what happened, what went wrong in case of an event or case of a compromise. And then software today is never built from the ground up. Everything isn't built, so you rely on a lot of libraries, a lot of tools, frameworks. So important to keep software bill of material. Another thing that the draft guidance is basically requesting that in the future, all 510Ks and PMAs will need to essentially submit a bill of materials for your software. And so just like we have hardware bill of materials, we need a software bill of materials, but importantly, we want to monitor them for their own cybersecurity threats. So for example, if you're using a logging library, and that logging library now has some vulnerabilities, you want to be able to track that vulnerability and ensure that the vulnerability is not exposed to your device. You may not be using those functions, so you may not be using the features within the library that have the vulnerability, or you're doing it in a way that the vulnerability is not exposed further down, or there may be actual vulnerabilities. You want to kind of do the analysis. You want to keep that part of your surveillance, ongoing surveillance, but also during design as well. There are several tools that allow you to, several free tools or paid tools allow you to kind of create a software bomb and then track well-known vulnerabilities from the CVE databases of those, assuming these are open source libraries. And this includes other things in your operating system if you're using one, any other software that's not yours. You want to kind of keep track and assess the vulnerabilities as it happens. And then enable secure design and coding practices, right, for software specifically. Secure coding basically is essentially a methodology that makes your developers think about security as they develop the code, and then same with the designers. So keep that, again, that's a little bit of the cultural aspect. So you start thinking about security at every step in the way, and that's important. And then security testing. So test for security early on, just as you do functional testing, you do other kinds of testing, electrical testing, mechanical testing, do software security testing, and penetration testings, and vulnerability scanners, things like that. A lot of good tools available, free and paid, that will allow you to do these. And eventually, I think at some point, depending on the risk, you may also want to consider some independent software consultants that can do this testing for you, especially if you have cloud-based aspects of things, or if you're expecting, or if you have functions and remote functions that are controlling your devices, or firmware updates that are happening. And so you want to make sure those are not being compromised in any way. So those are kind of the things you want to design. And then setting up a surveillance program. So again, as you move into operation, that surveillance programs is important. So again, going back to NIST, NIST has a very cool tool called cybersecurity framework. Essentially divides your entire process from a cybersecurity perspective into 5 phases, right? So the first one is identify. So this is what we talked about, risk assessment, identifying the vulnerabilities, prioritizing those. And then second is protect, which is designing risk mitigations. So as part of your design and development, you put in risk mitigations, and you also put risk mitigations during operations. If you have systems that are online, you may want to put simple things like firewalls and antivirus scanners and stuff, but also things like protections, log surveillance, other kinds of protections that you can have. But then as you start, things you want to keep in when events can happen. So first thing is, if cybersecurity event happens, you need to be able to detect it, and be able to detect it fast. So how do you do that? How do you put in tools and processes that can happen? So these, again, you have to think through, how will you do that, right? So would you be monitoring logs? If you have an audit log, are you monitoring, what functions are being done? Any privileged functions are being done at the wrong time? Do a iterative or a periodic review of those logs of the usage of the system, kind of look at device usage patterns and see if there's something that is wrong. So those kind of things, processes that you want to put in place to do any kind of detection around cybersecurity event. Once you detect, obviously you have to respond. And how do you respond to that? So first of the things you have to figure out is how do you mitigate that particular thing that's happening right now? So what are your mitigation plan? How do you stop it? And once you stop it, what are you doing after that? So you're not going to come up with a plan when an event happens. So this is something you have to do up front. You have to come up with processes and tools and people, and assign them responsibilities to live in case of a cybersecurity event. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to set up. Maybe that is, let's say you have a cloud system, and one of the response you can have if the cloud system is affected is to kind of set up a parallel system somewhere else and redirect all your devices to that. Or if your device is affected, find a way to kind of quarantine that device. So those kind of processes you have for different events or different scenarios, come up with ideas and plans and processes, and assign people. This is your responsibility. Try to have a cross-functional team to do that. And it's not just technical response, but also a lot of kind of a legal and kind of regulatory response, right? So if an event happens, you may be required under law or under whatever frameworks you are to notify, let's say maybe the government agencies, notify patients or providers, and there's a lot of these have certain deadlines. For example, if in a GDPR, the European standard, you have 72 hours. Some states in US have as much as 24 hours to notify. And you have to notify different people, and it depends on how many people are affected. So there's a lot of just complex aspect of it. So make sure your quality, your compliance teams are also in the loop, and they're part of this response team, so they can kind of do the non-technical aspect as well. And the last thing is you want to recover, right? So you responded, you did something, how do you recover? So this is, again, you do upfront, you do upfront some of this work and making sure that there's ways to recover, right? So are you keeping a backup of your data? Do you have a hot site? Do you have device functions that can be disabled in case, but then major functions are still available? So things like that, how do you recover so that the system as a whole is still working, even if it's reduced function for a while, it's still working, so that vast majority of users are not affected. So those are important things. And from a respond and recover and even detect, these are processes you do upfront, you set up, but you have to remember two things. One is you hope you never have to use them, but you have to practice them, because if you do have to use them and you haven't practiced them, you haven't done any test runs, it's not going to work. You're going to find things that are breaking. You're going to find things that didn't exist. For example, if you're doing backups as part of your recovery, you want to test that the backups that actually do exist, and you can actually you can restore those backups. We've had cases where people were doing backups or thinking they were doing backups of data, and the backup processes stopped or failed, and nobody knew, and it just kept. And when they actually needed it, there was no backups, and so they lost, a chunk of data, and becomes a business risk, not only just a patient or regular risk. So things like that. Make sure you when you set this up, that you are testing. You are just like anything else. You have to do trial runs. It's like a fire test. You do fire alarms every year or every 6 months. Same thing. You want to do this respond recover process as much as needed. I said, understand all the requisite reporting requirements. Important, because there's so many and they're so different from wherever you are, based on local, state, national, or international requirements. And then cross-functional teams are very important to have them, because there's aspects of recovering. It's not just from a security point of view, it's from a functional point of view, from a regulatory point of view, from a quality point of view, from a customer success point of view. So you do need that cross-functional teams to be able to respond and recover. And then setting up business protections, right? So as a business, where you design for the best, and you hope you operate in the best, you have the best intentions to manage cybersecurity. So you do all the right things, but stuff still happens. And so how do you protect your business in general? So first few things is to kind of understand agreements, understand your responsibilities, setting up that in writing of what you are required to do, so that you know what your role is. A lot of medical device companies, if they collect data, may become a business associate under HIPAA. So HIPAA has both covered entities, which are generally hospitals that are primarily responsible for managing patients' data. But a lot of time you may collect that data, you may have access to data, you may be providing access to the provider, you become a business associate of that hospital or that clinic. And under the updated HIPAA rules, under the high-tech law, a lot of those responsibilities get transferred to you as well. Not transferred, but you're essentially responsible for the same kind of protections. So you need to understand and have a clear agreement in place between your covered entities, whoever they are, so that you know what your responsibilities are. Similarly, if you are like a GDPR, if you're doing Europe or selling in Europe or having European customers, have a data processing agreement in place that identifies what your role is, whether you're a controller or you're a processor of data, because there are different requirements for those roles. And then kind of what are the specifics and what are you processing, what are you controlling, what are your specific requirements. And then a lot of the health delivery organizations nowadays, the hospitals, large health systems, are putting a lot of cybersecurity language into their contracts. So there's frameworks out there. There is organizations that are developing model contract languages that basically identify the responsibility of device makers, responsibility of hospitals, responsibility of patients within the cybersecurity framework. And so understand those model contract languages, make sure you understand your responsibilities and you have the right processes and people in place to be able to ensure that you comply with those contracts. And then just, very important, cybersecurity insurance. It's going to be expensive, but it is absolutely necessary if you're going to do anything with connectivity in general. So those were around cybersecurity and privacy. There's also regulatory consideration. What happens when you connect a device? So let's talk a little bit about that for the next 5 minutes. The most important thing is how do you classify your connected health component, right? If you have a device and let's say you have an app that is talking to a device, you may have a backend cloud system that's talking to a device or both of them. How do you classify all that stuff? If a device is a class 2, does your app become class 2? Is it an accessory device? Is your cloud an accessory device? Or can you structure your architecture and system where your cloud may become what's called a medical device system or a clinical decision support system? These are categories, at least in the FDA's framework, that require less, they're essentially class 1. So they don't require any kind of authorization upfront to market or any kind of PMA aspect of it. So can you do that? Again, this is a regulatory question. I'm not going to go super deep in this, but these are questions you need to ask your regulatory people, and how do you deal with that? And then that's why your ROI sometimes can come in place. Do you do it now upfront? Do you do it later once your device is approved? And then what are the ramifications for those kind of things? And as I said, your digital component might not be even a device, not even fall under any kind of regulation. Unlikely, but that's possible. Again, something for regulatory people to kind of thought. But this is questions you should ask them if you're considering any sort of connected health component. And the last thing about kind of cost and effort. So how do you build? Let's say you decided through the risk analysis and through all your regulatory aspects, you decided that the connectivity is important because the benefits outweigh any sort of risks and effort. So what do you do? Do you build? Do you buy? And it's kind of an age-old question. There's different pros and cons. Obviously, if you build, you have a full control and ownership, full customizable build to your needs. Cons is it generally takes more time, effort, and you run into not just you run into any project risk. Anytime you development, there's risk of schedule, risk of things not working, things like that. So you have a lot of development risks. If you buy, on the other hand, you drive down those risks. It's more cost effective. Generally, you have quick time to market for at least a connected aspect of it, and you have development risk reductions. And if you have if you're using a system that's used over and over time, then you also know that it has gone through several usages of that, so that overall risk reduction is there. And then cons, obviously you may have to compromise on functionality, you may not have full control and ownership. So again, you have to do that kind of analysis and what makes sense. If you do build though, if you build yourself, make sure you start with something that's available. Like for example, if you're doing cloud, work with a cloud infrastructure that is well tested, well available, like AWS, Azure. Don't try to roll your own data center on your own servers that sit in your offices. Those things, the effectivity and the cost of those infrastructure, the AWS and Azure and Google Cloud and stuff like that, is just so much more efficient than anything you build on your own. Make sure you build solution under whatever required compliance is from day one. Again, this whole lifecycle aspect is important in any software development. Security configuration, a lot of these general purpose infrastructure, because they target a wide variety of users, the security configuration may not be what you need, right? So for example, AWS may say, we are HIPAA compliant. What does that mean is generally that they have controls that can be enabled to be HIPAA compliant, but they may not be on or off, that they may not be on by default. So you have to know what those controls are, and you need to make sure those controls are configured properly. Build a team that's skilled in cloud IT, acquire tools and good monitoring and detection tools specifically. Develop a disaster management plan, and importantly, test it regularly, and then obviously set up all the right safeguards agreements that we just talked about. If you're buying, make sure whatever solution you're buying meets the required compliance. If you're going to buy, look for managed solution, because otherwise you still have the operational burdens and risks. So you want to kind of offload some of that risk, understand what your vendor's track record is in terms of security and privacy. Ask those questions. Have you had any security issues? If you did, what do you do? How do you ensure? If you're going to do global, if you have aims of being global, make sure that vendor solution can also scale. Otherwise, you run into different solutions across different geographies, can become very complex. And then understand how version control works. If specifically if they have solution that is updated, how do you control that updates, and what do you do when the updates happen? So understand all that mechanism as well. It's important to understand that from the get-go before you make a decision to buy. And then understand the responsibilities that the vendor is going to take and the liabilities that the vendor is going to take, right? So you're trying to offload some of the responsibilities and some of the liabilities. What does that offloading look like? How much of the cybersecurity risk and if there's an event and there's fines, for example, or lawyers need to be involved, where is that from a financial liability and also from a risk liability, from a reputational risk, what kind of liabilities the vendor is willing to take? So consider all those things if you're going to buy. Just a quick couple of slides on us. What we do is, my company is called Galen Cloud, and we are a cloud platform that we are purpose built for medical devices. When I say cloud platform, we still operate on top of AWS, but we provide a layer on top that is heavily structured and designed specifically for medical devices under full compliance. So we are ISO 13485 certified, we are HIPAA certified from a security perspective, and we have multiple clients. Only medical devices, all we do. And so we have services and structures that are very, very built for medical devices, provide quick integration, very flexible data workflows, web portals, visualizations, those kind of things, alerts, notifications, allow them to customize, extend the platform as well. We provide on average roughly 73% of cost savings amortized over 5-year costs. So 5-year, if you build your own, on average, what it will take to build and operate over 5 years, 73% reduction in cost in general. And then risk reduction as well. So I said because our systems is used across medical devices, many medical devices have already used that system. And so we have driven down some regular risks. They have gone to FDA, they've gone through CE mark, and then stuff like that. We provide a certificate of compliance that ensures all our compliance metrics, provide audit support. So if you get audited by regulatory bodies, by your standard bodies, we support that. Highly available, just standard stuff, backups, disaster recoveries, we do all that stuff. And then we take cybersecurity liabilities as part of our contractual requirement. So in conclusion, connected health is here to stay. There is a few risks that can be managed in terms of security, privacy, regulatory cost, but the benefits in terms of greater convenience, easier adherence, improved insights, and better health outcomes essentially are worth the risk, and at least that's what I think. Thanks again for coming to this presentation. If you do need to get in touch with me, if you have any questions later on, my information is right on the screen. You can check us out on galendia.com or follow our LinkedIn or Twitter pages for updates on kind of what we do. But thanks again for joining and listening. Hopefully it was worth it.